Hello and welcome. Tonight, we step somewhere the sun never quite manages to warm the silence. A garden pavilion built entirely of glass, standing in the quiet grounds of an English country house. A man is murdered inside it. The doors were locked. The walls let in every ray of daylight, every passing shadow, every curious eye from the lawn beyond. And yet, no one saw a thing. Hercule Poirot, that most meticulous of Belgian detectives, is summoned to a house where nothing is hidden from view, and everything is hidden all the same. Because clarity, as he will discover, can be the most convincing disguise of all. If you enjoy a good old-fashioned puzzle, the kind with secrets behind polished glass and lies behind polished manners, settle in. Let's step into the pavilion together. An invitation to Ashcombe. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Hercule Poirot always considered an unremarkable day for remarkable news to begin. It was written in a hand he did not immediately recognize. A hand that had once been elegant, he thought, but had since acquired the small tremors of age or worry, or perhaps both. The paper was good stock, cream-colored, faintly scented with lavender water, the kind favored by ladies of a certain generation who had never quite adjusted to the notion of writing on anything cheaper. My dear M. Poirot, you will not remember me, though we met once, many years ago, at a dinner given by Lady Anstruther. I am told you are the only man in England, or out of it, capable of seeing what others cannot. I find myself in need of precisely such a man. My husband believes we are merely inviting you to view his orchids. I would be obliged if you allowed him to believe this a little longer. Yours in some anxiety. Constance Wrenfield Poirot read the letter twice, then a third time, setting it down upon the small mahogany table beside his breakfast tray, with the particular care he gave to objects he suspected might later prove significant. He was a man who trusted very little to chance, and even less to the disorder of an unexamined thought. "George," he said to his manservant, who was refilling the coffee with the silent efficiency of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything his employer did before 9 in the morning. "Tell me, does the name Wrenfield mean anything to you?" George considered this with the gravity he applied to all questions, however small. "Wrenfield, sir. Ashcombe Hall, if I am not mistaken. Somerset. The family made their money in glass, I believe. Window glass, greenhouse glass, that sort of article. Very old money by now. Though I understand the current Mr. Wrenfield has rather more enthusiasm for orchids than for business." "Glass," Poirot murmured, and something in the small precision of his moustache seemed to sharpen, as it always did when a fact arrived that pleased him, for reasons he had not yet examined. How very appropriate. He was not, by nature, a man who enjoyed the countryside. The countryside, in Poirot's private estimation, was full of mud, uneven paths, and hedgerows that ruined the line of a good coat. But there was something in Mrs. Wrenfield's letter, the carefully suppressed anxiety beneath the polite phrasing, the instruction that her own husband must not know the true purpose of the visit, that appealed to the part of him which found domestic secrecy more fascinating than any locked bank vault. He wrote his acceptance that same afternoon, and by Thursday found himself on a train bound for Somerset, his patent leather shoes entirely unsuited to what he suspected would be a great deal of walking upon gravel. Ashcombe Hall revealed itself gradually, as the best English houses always did. First a stone gatehouse, half swallowed by ivy, then an avenue of lime trees, and finally the house itself, grey and gabled, sitting with the settled confidence of something that had never once doubted its right to exist. It was not the house, however, that caught Poirot's eye as the car rounded the final curve of the drive. It was the pavilion. It stood some distance from the main house, in what had once perhaps been a rose garden, and it was built, every wall, every roof panel, every door, entirely of glass, set within a slender framework of white-painted iron. It caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back in soft, shifting sheets, so that the whole structure seemed less a building than a held breath of light. "Mr. Wrenfield's pride and joy," said the driver, a taciturn man named Higgins, who had collected Poirot from the station with the enthusiasm of a man collecting a parcel he had not ordered. "Built it 3 years back. Orchids inside. Cost more than most men's houses, so I'm told, and I don't doubt it." "It is," Poirot said, leaning slightly toward the car window, "entirely transparent." "That's rather the point of glass, sir," said Higgins, with the flat patience of a man who had, evidently, made this joke before and found it wore thinner each time. Poirot did not smile. He was looking at the pavilion with the particular stillness of a man rearranging, very quietly, the furniture of his own mind. A room made entirely of glass, he was thinking, was a room in which a man might believe himself perfectly safe from secrecy, and perfectly wrong. Constance Wrenfield met him in the drawing-room, a slight woman of some 60 years, with the kind of beauty that had settled, rather than faded, into something more interesting than youth. She took his hand with both of hers, briefly, as though checking that he were real. "Thank you for coming, M. Poirot. I confess I did not expect you to accept so quickly. Madame, when a lady writes to me that she is in some anxiety and asks that her husband not know the reason for my visit, I find it very difficult to decline." He glanced about the drawing-room. Good furniture, slightly worn in the manner of things loved, rather than merely owned. Silver photograph frames, arranged with the particular density of a family both large and close. "You will tell me now, perhaps, what it is you fear." Mrs. Wrenfield's hands folded themselves together, the knuckles whitening slightly. "I fear," she said, "that someone in this house means my husband harm. I have no proof, M. Poirot. Only small things. A gate left open that is never left open. A letter that had been read before it reached me. My husband's tonic moved from its usual shelf. Nothing a magistrate would hear. But I have lived in this house for 30 years, and I know its habits as I know my own breathing, and something in those habits has changed. And Monsieur Wrenfield himself, does he share this fear?" "Edmund," said his wife, with the faint, fond exasperation of a woman describing a much-loved, but occasionally infuriating husband, believes the world is exactly as agreeable as his orchids. He would tell you there is not an unkind thought under this roof. He is wrong, M. Poirot. He has always been wrong about people. It is, I sometimes think, his only real fault." Poirot inclined his head, filing this observation away with the neat precision of a man cataloguing evidence before he had even been told a crime existed. "Then I shall look at your household, madame, as your husband looks at his orchids, very closely and without sentiment. Tell me, who is presently under this roof?" She told him. There was Edmund Wrenfield himself, 68, whose devotion to his glasshouse orchids apparently exceeded his devotion to the family glass business he had inherited and now largely ignored. There was his nephew, Roger Wrenfield, 30 years old, who managed what remained of that business with an impatience that suggested he resented managing it at all. There was Edmund's unmarried sister, Miss Beatrice Wrenfield, sharp-tongued and sharper-eyed, who had lived at the Hall since before Constance had married into it. There was a young woman, Ellen Marsh, employed as secretary to help Edmund catalogue his orchid collection for a book he had long promised to write and never finished. And there was Dr. Alistair Finch, a family friend of long standing and the local physician, presently staying at the Hall while his own cottage was being repaired. "A small enough gathering," Poirot said. "Small enough," Mrs. Wrenfield agreed, "that I have begun to suspect each of them in turn, Monsieur Poirot, and to be ashamed of myself for it by supper-time." It was, Poirot reflected, as a maid arrived to show him to his room, precisely the sort of household in which murder, should it come, and something in the stillness of that glass pavilion suggested to him that it might, would arrive not with violence, but with the quiet, well-mannered inevitability of an English tea being poured at exactly 4 o'clock. He did not yet know how right he was, nor did he yet know how wrong, In one small but significant particular, his own first instincts would prove to be. Orchids and Old Grievances. Edmund Wrenfield was, Poirot decided within the first 3 minutes of their acquaintance, a man who had spent so many years cultivating delicate things that he had come to treat people with the same gentle, slightly absent-minded care, as though everyone he met might, like his orchids, wilt if handled too firmly. He was a big man gone soft with age, pink-faced, white-whiskered, dressed in a linen jacket that had seen better decades. He received Poirot in the glass pavilion itself, among tiered benches of extraordinary blooms, waxen white, spotted crimson, a deep bruised purple that seemed to Poirot almost indecent in its richness. Poirot, an honor, a very great honor. Edmund pumped his hand with real warmth. My wife tells me you've an interest in orchids. I confess, I hardly believed her. One doesn't expect a detective to care for anything so quiet as a flower. Madame Wrenfield is, perhaps, being generous with the truth, Poirot said, permitting himself the smallest smile. But I find I am very willing to learn. This is a remarkable room, monsieur. And it was. The pavilion was perhaps 40 feet in length, its glass walls rising to a peaked glass roof, every pane fitted with such precision that the whole structure seemed to hum faintly with light. There were 2 doors, one facing the house, one facing the old rose garden beyond, both fitted, Poirot noted, with substantial brass locks of a kind one might expect on a bank rather than a greenhouse. You lock your orchids away very carefully, Monsieur Wrenfield. Edmund laughed, a comfortable, unhurried sound. Ah, that is not for the orchid's protection, Monsieur Poirot, whatever my wife may tell you. It's for the temperature. Close the doors, and the pavilion holds its heat beautifully, even in a Somerset February. Draughts are the enemy of the Cattleya, you understand. Not thieves. He gestured expansively at the blooms around him, though I dare say a determined thief would have quite a time getting in regardless. Both doors lock from the inside as well as out. My own design. I had rather too many afternoons ruined by Roger wandering in and leaving the door swinging. Your nephew does not share your enthusiasm, I think. Something passed briefly over Edmund's broad pink face. Not quite irritation, but its gentler cousin. Roger has his father's head for business, and none of his patience for beauty. More's the pity. He'd sell this pavilion for scrap glass if I let him, and put up something practical in its place. A tennis court, perhaps. He said it lightly, but Poirot, who made a private study of the small silences between a man's words, noted that Edmund did not laugh this time. You do not agree, I think, on matters of the estate. We do not agree on very much at all, Poirot, though I try not to hold it against him. His father, my brother, died when Roger was young, and I fear I have never quite managed to be to him what a father might have been. A man can love his nephew and still find him a considerable trial. He busied himself suddenly with a spray of pale green blooms, the particular business of a man who wished the subject changed. But you did not come to Ashcombe to hear an old man's family troubles. Tell me instead what you think of my Odontoglossum crispum. This specimen took me 11 years to bring to flower. Poirot admired the flower with the appropriate gravity, while privately reflecting that Edmund Wrenfield was either entirely as guileless as his wife believed, or a considerably better actor than his soft pink face suggested. It was, he thought, too early to know which. It was Roger himself who found them there some 20 minutes later, stepping into the pavilion with the brisk, unapologetic stride of a man who did not consider it necessary to knock on glass. He was dark where his uncle was fair, lean where Edmund had gone comfortably stout, and he carried about him the faint, permanent irritation of a young man who believed the world owed him rather more explanation than it had thus far provided. Uncle, the Bristol orders come back short again, 3rd month running. I told you that supplier was cheating us, and now I've the figures to prove it. He stopped short, seeing Poirot, and his dark eyes moved over the detective, with the swift, assessing look of a man accustomed to weighing the value of things at a glance. I beg your pardon. I didn't know we had a guest. Hercule Poirot, Edmund said, with rather more pride than the introduction perhaps required. "My nephew, Roger. Roger M. Poirot is a detective. A rather celebrated one, I gather, though he is far too modest to say so himself." Something flickered across Roger's face. Quick, unreadable, gone almost before Poirot could name it. "A detective," he repeated. "That's an odd sort of guest for an orchid house." "I am told," said Poirot pleasantly, "that your aunt has some small anxieties about the household. I am here, in part, to set her mind at ease." "My aunt," said Roger, with the flat precision of a man choosing his words with unusual care, "has always had a talent for finding trouble where none exists. No offense to her, M. Poirot. She means well, but I shouldn't waste too much of your very valuable time on Ashcombe's ghosts." He turned back to his uncle before Poirot could answer. "The figures, uncle. When you've a moment." He left as briskly as he had come, the glass door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final click. The particular sound, Poirot noted, of a lock catching that had not quite been meant to catch. Edmund sighed. The sound of a man long practiced in absorbing his nephew's abruptness without complaint. "You mustn't mind Roger. He carries the weight of the business rather more heavily than I ever did, and I fear I have given him little enough thanks for it." He glanced toward the door through which his nephew had vanished, and for a moment something almost sorrowful crossed his broad face. "He was not always so sharp, you know. He was rather a sweet boy once." "People are rarely only one thing, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "It is, I find, what makes them so endlessly worth the study." He found Miss Beatrice Wrenfield in the drawing-room before dinner, seated very upright in a chair positioned, Poirot noted, to command a clear view of both the door and the window. The seat, he thought, of a woman who had spent a lifetime preferring to observe rather than be observed. She was some years older than her brother Edmund, thin where he was stout, and possessed of a pair of pale, unblinking eyes that regarded Poirot with the frank, unhurried assessment one might give a piece of furniture being considered for purchase. "So you're the detective?" It was not a question. Constance's idea, I imagine. She has been fretting about this house like a hen with one chick for a fortnight now, and I confess I don't entirely see why. You do not share Madame's concerns. I share very few of Constance's concerns, M. Poirot. She is a dear woman, but she has always had rather more imagination than is good for her. Beatrice's pale eyes did not waver. "This is a perfectly ordinary house, full of perfectly ordinary grievances, of the kind every family carries, and none discusses at dinner. Roger resents that Edmund controls money. Roger believes he could spend more wisely. Edmund resents, though he would never say so, that his own brother's son shows him so little warmth. Ellen Marsh is paid to catalogue orchids, and I suspect paid rather better than the work strictly requires. And Dr. Finch?" She paused, the smallest of pauses, no longer than a held breath. "Dr. Finch is an old friend and a good doctor, and I have nothing whatever to say against him." Poirot, who had built a long career upon the small pauses that people believed passed unnoticed, filed this one away with particular care. "You have summarized your household most efficiently, mademoiselle. I have lived in it 51 years, Monsieur Poirot. One learns to summarize, or one drowns in the detail." She rose, smoothing her skirts with brisk, economical movements. "I shall tell you what I told Constance. There is no mystery at Ashcombe Hall. There is only a family that has lived together rather too long, in rather too much comfort, to remember how to be entirely honest with one another. That is not a crime. It is merely a marriage, of sorts, that a house makes with its inhabitants, over time." She left him then, and Poirot stood alone for a moment among the good, worn furniture and the silver-framed photographs, turning her words over with the care he gave to anything that had been offered a shade too readily, a shade too smoothly, to be entirely without design. "There is no mystery at Ashcombe Hall," she had said. Poirot, gazing through the drawing-room window at the glass pavilion catching the last amber light of evening, found himself very calmly, very certainly, of the opposite opinion. The body in the glass. It happened, as these things so often do, on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Poirot had risen early, a habit he had never managed to lose, despite George's frequent and gentle suggestion that a man of his eminence might allow himself a later breakfast. He had taken his coffee at the window of his room, watching the mist lift slowly off the lawns, and had noted, with the idle attention he gave to all details, useful or not, that the gardener, a weathered, taciturn man named Buller, had already crossed the grounds twice before 8 o'clock, each time glancing toward the pavilion with an expression Poirot could not quite place. It was Ellen Marsh who found the body. She came running across the lawn at 9:30, her cardigan flying open, her usually neat hair coming loose from its pins, and the sound she made reaching the house before her words did, a high, thin cry that brought Constance Wrenfield to the drawing-room door, with her hand pressed flat against her chest. "Mr. Wrenfield, the pavilion, oh, someone come, please, someone come at once." Poirot reached the pavilion within 2 minutes, moving with a speed that rather surprised those who judged a man's urgency by the length of his legs alone. Roger arrived at almost the same moment, Dr. Finch close behind him, and Beatrice Wrenfield followed at a more measured pace, that nonetheless brought her to the glass door before either of the younger men could open it. The door was locked. Poirot saw this at once, and saw too, through the clear glass, precisely why it did not matter that the door was locked, for the whole horror of the scene lay open to view as plainly as a photograph pinned behind glass in a shop window. Edmund Wrenfield lay upon the stone-flagged floor of his beloved pavilion, among the scattered fragments of a shattered orchid pot, one arm flung out toward the door, as though he had been reaching for it at the last. A dark stain had spread across the pale linen of his jacket, just below the shoulder, and his broad pink face had gone the color of old wax. He was, quite unmistakably, dead. "The door," Roger said, his voice cracking oddly on the single word. "The door's locked. Uncle Edmund never locks it from inside when he's alone. He always—" He broke off, and threw his shoulder against the frame with a force that rattled the glass in its iron mullions, but did nothing whatever to open it. "Monsieur Roger, I beg you, do not break the glass." Poirot's voice carried a note of quiet authority that stopped Roger's second attempt mid-motion. "If a crime has occurred here, we must not destroy what the glass itself may tell us. There is another door, I think, the one facing the rose garden?" It was Dr. Finch who ran for it, his physician's training evidently overriding whatever shock had briefly stilled him, and he returned within a minute with the news that the second door, too, was locked fast. "Both locked," Poirot murmured, almost to himself, gazing through the glass at the small, terrible tableau within, the fallen man, the shattered pot, the bright, indifferent morning sun pouring through every pane. Both locked, from within, and not a soul to be seen entering or leaving. And yet nothing hidden, messieurs, nothing hidden at all. It was Buller the gardener, summoned at a run, who produced the second key. Kept, he explained, on a nail in the potting shed for precisely such emergencies as a jammed lock. And it was Poirot who insisted, over Roger's evident impatience, that no one enter before he himself had looked, and looked carefully, through every pane of that transparent room. "You will forgive me," he said, to the small, anxious cluster gathered outside the glass, "if I ask you all to remain exactly where you are standing, for just a little moment longer. A room of glass, mesdames, messieurs, is a most unusual scene of crime. It permits us to see everything, and it is precisely because we may see everything that we are in the greatest danger of overlooking the one thing that matters." He studied the pavilion floor to ceiling before he permitted the door unlocked. The angle of Edmund's fallen body, the scattering of soil and broken clay from the shattered pot, a heavy brass watering can lying on its side some feet away, its spout dented, a scrap of purple orchid petal ground into paste beneath one polished heel print in the loose earth of a nearby bench. He noted, too, that every window catch he could see from outside appeared closed, every pane of glass entirely without so much as a crack, and both doors, he confirmed this himself, testing each with his own gloved hand before permitting Buller's key near the lock, fastened with the particular, unmistakable click of a bolt thrown from the inside. "Well, M. Poirot." Beatrice's voice, from just behind his shoulder, was steady, though her pale eyes had not left the glass. "Is my brother murdered, or has he simply had the very bad manners to die of a heart attack in his own greenhouse?" Poirot turned to look at her for a long moment before answering. "Mademoiselle, your brother has a wound in his shoulder that no heart attack ever produced, and beside his hand lies a watering can with a dent that matches very precisely the shape of that wound. Whether it was struck by his own hand, in some terrible accident, or by another's, this I cannot yet say. But I will tell you what I can say." He looked back through the glass, at the still, sunlit horror within. Every door of this room was locked from the inside. Every window is closed and without damage. And yet, mademoiselle, I do not for one moment believe that your brother locked himself into this room in order to die. Behind him, he heard Constance Wrenfield make a small, terrible sound, quickly muffled, and felt, though he did not turn to see it, the particular stillness of a household in which every single person present had, in that instant, begun very carefully not to look at one another. The pavilion, transparent in every pane, had shown them everything, and told them, as yet, almost nothing at all. It was, Poirot reflected grimly, as Buller's key finally turned in the lock, precisely the sort of contradiction upon which the very best, and very worst, of murders were built. Every angle, no shadow. Dr. Finch knelt beside the body for a long while before he spoke, his fingers moving with the brisk, impersonal competence of a man who had learned, over many years of country practice, to set grief aside until it could be afforded. "Struck once, from behind and slightly above," he said at last, rising and wiping his hands upon his handkerchief with more care than the gesture strictly required. "A single blow, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been near enough instantaneous. A mercy, I suppose, though I hardly like to use the word in a room such as this." He glanced at the brass watering can, still lying where it had fallen. "That would do it, M. Poirot. If it was swung with any real weight behind it, the dent matches well enough. You are quite certain, Doctor, that it was this object, and not some other. Certain enough for a preliminary judgment. The police surgeon will confirm it, I've no doubt." Finch's professional composure slipped, very briefly, into something rawer. "I have known Edmund Wrenfield 30 years, M. Poirot. He never harmed a living thing in his life beyond the occasional greenfly. I cannot imagine who would want him dead, and I find I cannot yet quite believe that anyone did." "And yet," Poirot said gently, "someone has." He turned his attention back to the pavilion itself, moving through it now with the door unlocked and the small crowd of the household kept carefully at its threshold, admitted only one at a time and only at his own invitation. He walked its length slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his sharp, dark eyes traveling over every bench, every pane, every shadow that the abundant glass permitted to exist at all. It was, he thought, a room built to defeat concealment, and yet a man lay dead within it, and no one, not the gardener crossing the lawn at first light, not the maid laying breakfast, not Constance Wrenfield taking her tea by the drawing-room window with a clear view across the grounds. No one had seen a single soul approach or leave. "Tell me," he said, when Buller the gardener was brought before him, cap twisted in weathered hands. "You were about the grounds early this morning. You crossed toward the pavilion, I think, not once but twice, before 8 o'clock. Buller's eyes flicked, briefly, toward the house. "Aye, sir. Mr. Wrenfield liked the heating checked of a morning, before he came out himself. Boiler's temperamental this time of year, and on both occasions the pavilion was as it should be, locked, undisturbed. Locked, sir. I didn't go in. Hadn't the key on me. Only the potting shed spare, and no cause to use it. I looked through the glass, like, same as anyone might, and all seemed well. Mr. Wrenfield weren't up yet himself, far as I could tell. You are quite certain he was not already within? Buller hesitated, just long enough that Poirot's attention sharpened like a drawn blade. Couldn't rightly say for certain, sir. There's benches block the view from some angles, even in glass. But I didn't see him, and I didn't see nothing amiss, and that's the truth of it. Poirot considered this, a room of glass, and yet a room in which a man might still, from certain angles, remain unseen. He turned the thought over with care, sensing in it something that mattered more than he yet understood. One thing more, Monsieur Buller. The rose garden door. Who besides yourself and Monsieur Wrenfield holds a key? Just the 2 locks and 2 keys as I know of, sir. Mr. Wrenfield kept both on his own ring. As a rule, didn't like others meddling with his orchids' heating. The spare on the shed nail is a 3rd, but that's for emergencies only, and I'd have known if it were taken, for I check that nail most mornings out of habit. And was it there, this morning, when you checked it? Buller's weathered face creased in sudden, uncomfortable thought. That's an odd thing, sir, now you ask it. It were there when I fetched it for you gentlemen, right enough. But I couldn't rightly swear it were there earlier. When I passed at 7, I didn't look close. Never had cause to before today. Poirot said nothing for a long moment, merely inclined his head in the small, precise manner of a man placing a fact carefully upon a shelf where he might find it again. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of small uncertainty upon which an entire case might eventually turn. And exactly the kind of small uncertainty a lesser investigator might have let pass unremarked, in a room where everything, after all, appeared to be in plain view. He interviewed Ellen Marsh next, in the small morning room Constance had offered for the purpose, and found her still considerably shaken, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she did not appear to be drinking. I only went to fetch the ledger of new orchid arrivals, she said, when Poirot had settled himself opposite her, with the unhurried patience he reserved for witnesses whose distress was, he judged, entirely genuine. Mr. Wrenfield asked me to bring it to him first thing, so we might begin the cataloguing before breakfast. I knocked, and when there was no answer, I looked through the glass, and her voice caught. I am so very sorry, M. Poirot. I don't believe I shall ever look at that pavilion again without seeing it. You have my sympathy, mademoiselle, and I do not intend to prolong your distress unnecessarily. Only tell me, in the moment before you saw Monsieur Wrenfield, was there anything about the pavilion that struck you as unusual? Anything at all, however small? Ellen frowned, her fingers tightening around the cup. The door was locked, which was not unusual in itself. He often locked it while working, for the heat, you understand. But, she stopped. Mademoiselle? It's only. I thought I heard voices, M. Poirot, a little before I went out. Raised, I mean, not words I could make out, only the shape of an argument, coming from somewhere near the pavilion. I assumed it was Mr. Wrenfield and his nephew. They argued often enough about the business, and I confess I did not think a great deal of it at the time. I wish now that I had looked out the window instead of simply listening. What time was this, do you think? Not long before I found him. 20 minutes, perhaps. I cannot be certain. Poirot thanked her with the particular gentleness he reserved for the genuinely frightened, and sat for some minutes alone in the morning room afterward, turning this new fact over with care. A raised voice, 20 minutes before the body was found, a locked door, and a second key whose whereabouts that morning could not quite be accounted for. A man dead in a room that hid nothing from the eye, and, evidently, everything from the truth. The room shows us everything, he thought, gazing out at the pavilion's bright glass roof catching the midday sun, and that, I begin to suspect, is precisely the difficulty. A man may hide a great deal behind a locked door of solid oak, and we would suspect it at once. But who thinks to suspect a room that hides nothing at all? It was, he reflected, rising at last to seek out Roger Wrenfield, a very small mistake to make, The mistake of trusting transparency simply because it declared itself transparent. And he made a private note, with the particular honesty he reserved for himself alone, that he had very nearly made it too. The nephew's ledger. Roger Wrenfield had shut himself in the estate office, a small, book-lined room at the rear of the house that smelled of old ledgers and pipe tobacco. And he did not look up immediately when Poirot entered, though his pen had stopped moving across the page some time before. "I suppose you've come to ask me where I was this morning," he said, at last, setting down the pen with exaggerated care. "Everyone will ask me that, I imagine, before the day is out. I may as well have the answer prepared." "It is, monsieur. Rather a natural question, in the circumstances. I was here, in this office, from 7:30 until Ellen came screaming across the lawn." Roger's dark eyes met Poirot's, steady enough, though a small muscle worked at the corner of his jaw. "I've no witness to it, if that's what you're about to ask. My aunt was at her tea, Beatrice was dressing, Ellen was fetching her ledger, and Finch was shaving, or so he tells me. A house full of people, M. Poirot, and not one of us can vouch for another before 9:30. Rather convenient, isn't it, for whoever did this? You believe, then, that someone did do this? That your uncle's death was not some terrible accident?" Roger's jaw tightened further. "I believe my uncle never had an accident in that pavilion in 3 years of pottering about it, and I don't propose to believe he chose this particular morning to have his first." Poirot moved to the window, looking out across the lawn toward the pavilion, still cordoned now by a single uniformed constable sent up from the village, awaiting the arrival of the Somerset police in greater force. "Mademoiselle Marsh tells me she heard raised voices near the pavilion, some 20 minutes before your uncle was found. An argument, she believed. Was this argument perhaps your own?" For a long moment Roger said nothing at all, and Poirot, who had learned long ago that silence was itself a kind of answer, waited with the patience of a man for whom time held no particular urgency. "Yes," Roger said finally, the word dragged out of him like a splinter. "Yes, it was. I went to him early, before breakfast, before anyone else was about, because I'd found the Bristol figures the night before, and I could not let it wait another hour. We argued rather badly, if you must know, M. Poirot. I told him he was ruining the business with his indulgence of suppliers he liked and his indifference to suppliers who cheated him. I told him—" He stopped, his voice roughening. "I told him he cared more for his damned orchids than for the family that would inherit nothing but his debts. And how did Monsieur Wrenfield respond to this accusation? He laughed at me." Roger's hands had curled unconsciously into fists upon the desk. "Not unkindly. He never did anything unkindly. That was rather the maddening thing about him. But he laughed and said I worried a great deal too much for a young man, and that the business would still be there whether or not I spent my mornings shouting at old men over orchid beds. And then he turned back to his flowers, and I left. He looked up, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face now. The anger burned away, to leave only a rather young man's grief. That was the last thing I ever said to him, M. Poirot, that he cared more for flowers than for me. And I left him alive, laughing at me, among his orchids, and 20 minutes later he was dead on the floor of that room, and I cannot prove to a single living soul that I did not do it myself." Poirot studied him for a long moment, the clenched hands, the raw voice, the eyes that did not slide away from his own, even in the telling of a confession that did him no credit whatever. It was, he thought, either the demeanor of an innocent man, unburdening a guilty conscience of guilt that was merely emotional rather than criminal, or it was a performance of quite remarkable skill. "Tell me, Monsieur Roger, when you left your uncle, was the pavilion door locked or unlocked?" Roger blinked, the question evidently unexpected. "Unlocked. I left it unlocked myself. I remember thinking, even as I stormed off, that he'd have to get up and lock it after me, since he always did, once he was alone with his flowers, and I recall being childishly glad of the small inconvenience I'd caused him. A ghost of something that might, in gentler circumstances, have been a smile crossed his face and vanished. It seems a very foolish thing to have thought now. On the contrary, monsieur, it is a most useful thing to have thought, and I thank you for the honesty of telling me so. Poirot moved toward the door, then paused. One thing more. You mentioned the Bristol figures. A supplier, I think you said, who has been cheating the estate for some months. Do you have these figures still? Roger's eyes narrowed slightly, some of the earlier wariness returning. I do. Why do you ask? Because, monsieur, a man who discovers he is being cheated of money is a man with a grievance, and a grievance, in my experience, very rarely confines itself neatly to the person against whom it was first directed. Poirot inclined his head. I should like to see these figures if I may, and I should like very much to know the name of this supplier who has proved so much less honest than the flowers your uncle preferred to his company. Roger, after a moment's hesitation, drew a slim ledger from the desk drawer and slid it across without another word. Poirot studied the neat columns of figures, shipments, invoices, sums that did not quite reconcile, with the close attention he gave to any document that a man had troubled to keep so carefully organized, and found, in the small margin beside one entry some 3 months past, a single word penciled in Edmund Wrenfield's own hand, in the soft, rounded script Poirot had already come to recognize from the letter that had first summoned him to Ashcombe. The word was a name, and it was not, Poirot noted with the particular quickening of interest he reserved for facts that arrived unlooked for and entirely unwelcome to at least one person in the room, the name of any supplier at all. A sister's silence. The name penciled in the margin of Roger's ledger was Finch. Poirot regarded it for a long moment before closing the book gently and returning it across the desk. He said nothing of it to Roger, not yet, for a name written beside a column of figures that did not reconcile might mean a very great deal, or it might mean nothing at all beyond an old man's habit of jotting notes to himself in whatever margin lay nearest to hand. It was, he reminded himself, exactly the sort of discovery that tempted a detective toward haste, and haste, in Poirot's long experience, was the one indulgence a man investigating murder could least afford. He found Beatrice Wrenfield in the small sitting room that had evidently been hers alone for the better part of 5 decades. A room of good, hard chairs, and no unnecessary softness, much like its occupant. You will want to ask me where I was, she said, before he had so much as taken his seat, and I shall save us both the trouble. I was dressing, M. Poirot, alone, as I am every morning at that hour, and no one saw me, and I cannot prove otherwise, any more than the rest of this wretched household can prove anything at all this morning. You anticipate my questions most efficiently, mademoiselle. I have lived a long while. Poirot and I have found that efficiency is the only mercy left to a woman of my age. Ask what you came to ask. He studied her a moment. The upright spine, the pale, unblinking eyes, the hands folded with a stillness that seemed, to Poirot's careful attention, very slightly too deliberate, as though stillness itself required some effort to maintain. Very well, mademoiselle. Tell me of Dr. Finch. Something flickered behind those pale eyes, brief but unmistakable, like a shutter opening and closing upon a lit room. Alistair? What has he to do with any of this? That, mademoiselle, is precisely what I am attempting to discover. You told me, when first we spoke, that you had nothing whatever to say against him. I have since come to wonder whether that was quite the same as having nothing to say. Beatrice's mouth thinned into a hard, pale line. You are very quick to read insinuation into an old woman's good manners, Monsieur Poirot. I am quick, mademoiselle, to read insinuation into a pause, and you paused, when first you spoke his name, in a manner you did not pause for any other person in this house. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, unhurried, certain that a woman who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of saying little would eventually find silence itself the harder discipline to maintain. Alistair Finch, she said at last, her voice very low, asked my brother 18 months ago for a loan against his practice. His investments had gone badly. Some foolish business with a mining concern. I never had the details, nor wished for them. Edmund gave it to him freely, as Edmund gave everything freely, without a note of hand, without a whisper to a solicitor, because Edmund believed the whole world was as honest as his orchids. I do not know that the loan has been repaid, M. Poirot. I do not know that it ever will be, now that Edmund is no longer here to forgive the debt, as he always forgave everything. Her hands, at last, had lost their careful stillness, twisting once, sharply, in her lap. I said I had nothing against him, because I did not wish to believe that a man I have known 30 years, a man who sat at this family's table more often than his own, could have wanted my brother dead over a sum of money that Edmund would gladly have written off entirely, had Alistair only found the courage to ask him plainly. You believe, then, that he did not find that courage? I believe, Beatrice said, rising abruptly and moving to the window, her back very straight, that I do not wish to believe anything at all this morning, M. Poirot, and that you would do this house a kindness by allowing an old woman a few hours of that particular luxury before you take it entirely away from her. Poirot rose also, inclining his head with genuine gentleness. I shall trouble you no further today, mademoiselle, but I must ask one thing more, and I ask it because I believe you, of everyone in this house, will answer it most truthfully. Do you believe your nephew Roger capable of striking his uncle down? Beatrice turned from the window, and for the first time since he had met her, something like real feeling moved openly across her sharp, controlled face. Roger loved his uncle, M. Poirot, however badly he showed it this morning. I have watched that boy grow from the cradle, and I tell you plainly, his anger has always been the anger of a son who wanted more attention, never the anger of a man who wanted less family. Look elsewhere for your murderer. You will not find him in that office, shouting about invoices. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, walking the gravel path back toward the pavilion in the thin gold light of early afternoon, a conversation that had given him a great deal, a debt, a motive, a name penciled in a dead man's own hand, and yet he found himself troubled by something smaller, some detail glimpsed and then lost again before he could properly examine it, like a fish seen turning beneath dark water. He stopped beside the pavilion, now empty of its constable, who had gone to take his dinner in the kitchen, and looked through the glass at the chalk outline the local sergeant had drawn upon the flagstones where Edmund Wrenfield had fallen, the watering can, the shattered pot, the bench of orchids, undisturbed but for one broken bloom. It was the orchid bench that drew him back inside, ducking beneath the police tape with the unapologetic confidence of a man who considered such tape a suggestion rather than a law. He crouched beside the bench, studying the crushed purple petal he had noted that first terrible morning, ground into the loose soil beneath a single heel print. A heel print. He had noted it, catalogued it, and moved on to matters that seemed, at the time, of greater urgency: the locked doors, the missing key, the raised voices. He had not asked himself, until this moment, whose heel it might have been, nor why a person standing at that particular bench, some distance from where Edmund had fallen, should have needed to shift their weight sharply enough to leave so deep and clear a mark. He measured it now with his eye, comparing its size and shape against what he recalled of the shoes he had observed that morning. Roger's stout brown brogues, Dr. Finch's soft-soled physician's shoes, his own patent leather entirely unsuited to Somerset gravel. It was neither Roger's shoe nor the doctor's. It was, Poirot realized with the particular cold clarity of a man recognizing his own oversight, a heel far too narrow and far too small to belong to any man in that house at all. He had walked past it twice already that day, so entranced by the transparency of the room, by the puzzle of its locked doors, and its impossible witnesslessness, that he had failed, for the better part of a full day, an oversight he did not enjoy admitting even to himself, to ask the very simplest of questions. A woman's heel, he thought, straightening slowly, standing at this bench, close enough to strike, while Edmund Wrenfield lay dying not 6 feet away. It was, he told himself with the particular honesty he reserved for his own errors, a small mistake, the sort any man might make, dazzled as he had been by glass and light, and the very obviousness of the room's design. But it was a mistake nonetheless, and Hercule Poirot, standing alone now among the orchids in the fading afternoon, resolved that it would be his last one in this case, however many more remained to be uncovered before its end. The doctor's truth. Dr. Alistair Finch was packing his medical bag with unnecessary thoroughness when Poirot found him in the small guest room he had occupied since his own cottage roof had begun leaking some weeks before. A room that overlooked, Poirot noted as he entered, a clear and uninterrupted view of the pavilion below. "I understand the local police will want a formal statement from me shortly," Finch said, not looking up, as the only medical man on the premises, and an old friend besides. "I imagine that puts me in a rather delicate position." "Poirot, whichever way this business turns, it is, Doctor, a position you might have avoided entirely by telling me, when first we spoke, of the money Monsieur Wrenfield lent you 18 months past." Finch's hands stilled over the bag. He did not turn around at once, and when he did, his face had the greyish, resigned look of a man who had known, all along, that the truth would find him eventually, and had merely hoped for a little more time. "Beatrice told you, I imagine. She never could keep a confidence past a second cup of tea. God rest her patience with the rest of us." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "Very well. Yes, I borrowed rather more than I could comfortably repay, and Edmund gave it to me without a moment's hesitation, without so much as a signature on paper, because that was the man he was, generous to the point of carelessness with everyone he loved. I have repaid perhaps a third of it. I do not know how I should have repaid the rest, and I confess the thought has kept me from easy sleep more nights than I care to admit. This is, Doctor, a motive that any competent policeman would find most compelling. I am aware of that, Monsieur Poirot, which is precisely why I did not volunteer it." Finch's voice roughened. "But I did not kill Edmund Wrenfield. I would have gone to my grave still owing him, and gladly, rather than lift a hand against the one man in Somerset who never once made me feel the debt at all. Where were you, Doctor, at the hour your friend was killed? Shaving, alone, in this room." Finch gestured, with something like bitter humor, at the small basin in the corner. "The most useless alibi a man ever offered, I imagine, and every word of it true." Poirot moved to the window, looking down at the pavilion, its glass roof catching the last, pale gold of the afternoon. "Tell me, Doctor, as a physician and as a man who has known this household many years, do you believe Roger Wrenfield capable of murder? Roger has a temper and a grievance, and neither of those makes a man a killer." Finch shook his head slowly. "I have stitched that boy's cut knees since he was 6 years old. Poirot, he shouts. He has never, in all the years I have known him, struck a living thing. And Mademoiselle Marsh? Or Madame Wrenfield herself?" Finch's head came up sharply. "Constance, you cannot be serious. The woman adored her husband. I make no accusation, Doctor. I ask only questions, and I ask them of everyone, without exception, for it is only by asking them of everyone that I may eventually arrive at the one answer that is true." Poirot turned from the window, his sharp eyes settling on Finch with sudden quiet intensity. "There is one thing more I would ask of you, and I would ask that you answer with the very great care a physician gives to a diagnosis. When you examined the body, you told me the blow was struck from behind and slightly above. Tell me, would such a blow require a great deal of strength? The strength, say, of a man such as Roger Wrenfield, or might it have been struck, with sufficient force and a sufficient measure of surprise, by someone considerably less powerful?" Finch considered this with evident care, the professional part of him rising, gratefully, above the personal distress of the last hours. The watering can is heavy enough on its own, Miss Poirot, that momentum would do most of the work, provided the blow was swung with real commitment and landed true. I should not like to say it was beyond the strength of a woman. I should not like to say that at all. Poirot inclined his head slowly, the small, precise gesture of a man setting one more fact upon an already crowded shelf. Thank you, Doctor. You have been, I think, more honest with me in these last minutes than in all our conversation before it, and I am obliged to you for it. He left Finch sitting on the edge of the bed, his bag half packed, and his face turned once more toward the window and the pavilion below, and made his way down through the quiet house with the particular stillness of a man who believed, at last, that he was close, very close, to the shape of the truth, though several of its edges remained, as yet, stubbornly out of focus. He found Constance Wrenfield alone in the drawing-room, seated exactly where she had been on the morning of his arrival, though the warmth had gone entirely out of her face, replaced by the grey, hollowed stillness of new grief, carefully held in check. "You have spoken to everyone now, I think, Monsieur." "Poirot," she said without turning. "Beatrice, Roger, Alistair, Ellen, even poor Buller, I imagine, twisting his cap in his hands. A small, bleak sound that was almost a laugh. You have not yet asked me anything at all, beyond the questions you asked before my husband was even dead. I am asking you now, madame. Where were you this morning between 7:30 and 9:30? Here, in this room, taking my tea by that window, exactly as I have done every morning for 30 years. She turned to face him at last, and her eyes, red-rimmed but steady, met his without flinching. "I saw nothing, M. Poirot. I saw the lawn, and the mist lifting off it. And I saw nothing at all until Ellen came running, screaming, and my whole life ended with her scream. You wrote to me, madame, that you feared someone in this house meant your husband harm. You wrote it before he was killed. I must ask you now, whom did you suspect?" Her hands twisted together in her lap, the same gesture Poirot had seen her make on the first day of his visit. "I did not know, Monsieur Poirot. That was the whole terrible truth of it. I suspected everyone, and I suspected no one, because I could not believe that anyone under this roof was truly capable of it. I see now that I was wrong to disbelieve it. I only wish I had been wrong sooner, and loudly enough that someone might have listened, and Edmund might still be tending his orchids this very moment, instead of lying in that dreadful little room in the village." Poirot studied her for a long moment, the careful stillness of grief, the small, betraying tremor in her folded hands, a tremor that seemed to him, on this occasion, entirely and unmistakably genuine. "Madam," he said gently, "I believe I am very close now to knowing who killed your husband. I ask that you gather the household this evening, in this room, at 8 o'clock. I believe it is time, at last, that Ashcombe Hall stopped hiding its secrets behind glass, and allowed me to hold them up, instead, to the light." Reflections. The drawing-room, at 8 o'clock, held its small company, with the particular hush of a room that already suspected what was about to be said within it. Constance Wrenfield sat nearest the cold hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Beatrice occupied the upright chair she always chose, her pale eyes fixed upon Poirot with an intensity that betrayed, for once, something closer to fear than composure. Roger stood rather than sat, one shoulder against the mantelpiece, his dark eyes shadowed with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the whole day being silently suspected. Dr. Finch had taken the chair nearest the door, as though some part of him still contemplated escape, and Ellen Marsh sat very quietly at the edge of the room, her hands folded neatly around a handkerchief she had not, Poirot noted, yet needed to use. "I thank you all," Poirot began, standing before the dark, empty hearth, "for gathering here this evening, at what I know is a most painful hour for every one of you. I promised Madame Wrenfield that I would bring some clarity to this house before the day was ended, and I intend, now, to keep that promise. He paced a slow half-circle before the assembled company, hands clasped behind his back. When I first came to Ashcombe, I was struck, as I think you were all struck, on that terrible morning, by the very great strangeness of a murder committed in a room made entirely of glass. A room with nothing to hide behind. A room in which every angle, every corner, every shadow was laid open to the sky. I confess to you now, quite freely, that this transparency deceived me, for a little while, as I believe it deceived every one of you also. We none of us thought to ask what might be concealed in a room that appeared, by its very design, to conceal nothing at all. He paused before Roger. Monsieur Roger argued with his uncle that morning, bitterly, and about money, which is so often the engine of family grief. He left the pavilion door unlocked behind him, in a small fit of temper that he has, I think, regretted every hour since. It was natural, was it not, that suspicion should fall upon him first, the last man known to have quarrelled with the victim, and no alibi beyond an empty office and an angry heart. I didn't do it, Roger said, low and rough. No, monsieur, you did not. Poirot turned, nor did Dr. Finch, though I confess his debt to Monsieur Wrenfield gave me pause for some hours. A man who owed a great sum to his oldest friend, unable to say how he might ever have repaid it. A motive of considerable weight, on paper, but a debt forgiven so freely by a man as generous as Edmund Wrenfield is a very poor reason to kill him, and Dr. Finch, I think, knew this better than anyone in this room. Finch let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he entered. I turned then, Poirot went on, to the household's older grievances. A sister who watched her brother's family with the sharp eyes of one accustomed to seeing everything and saying little. Mademoiselle Beatrice, you told me on my first day here that there was no mystery at Ashcombe Hall. I did not believe you then. I believe you rather more now. For the mystery, I have come to think, was never in this house's long history at all, but in a single, very small moment, easily overlooked. He stopped, at last, before Ellen Marsh. On the morning your employer died, mademoiselle, you told me you heard raised voices near the pavilion, some 20 minutes before you found him. This was true. It was Monsieur Roger's argument that you heard, and I believe you when you say you heard it. But you did not tell me, mademoiselle, that you yourself returned to that pavilion in the minutes that followed, after Monsieur Roger had gone, while the door still stood unlocked behind him. Ellen's hands had gone very still around the handkerchief. I did not understand, at first, why a young woman employed to catalogue orchids should have any quarrel with the man who employed her so generously. For generously, he did employ you, did he not, mademoiselle? Rather more generously, Mademoiselle Beatrice once observed to me, than the work of cataloguing flowers strictly required. Poirot's voice remained gentle, but it did not waver. It was a small thing that first troubled me, a heel print, pressed into the soil beside the orchid bench nearest where Monsieur Wrenfield fell. Too narrow, too small, for any man in this house. I confess to you all, quite honestly, that I noticed this mark on the very first morning, and did not think to ask, until a day too late, whose foot had made it. That was my error, and I do not offer it lightly, for a detective's small mistakes are, in a case such as this, very often the difference between justice delayed and justice denied. You cannot know. Ellen's voice was thin, high, breaking. I know, mademoiselle, because of the second key. Poirot's tone remained level, unhurried, the tone of a man laying down cards he had held, patiently, for hours. Both doors of the pavilion, Monsieur Wrenfield himself told me, lock from the inside as readily as from the outside, an ordinary key lock, mademoiselle, and not the simple bolt that everyone in this house assumed it to be. The spare key, kept upon a nail in the potting shed, could not be sworn to its place by Buller the gardener when he passed at 7 that morning. I believe, mademoiselle, that you took that key some days before, perhaps to let yourself quietly in and out of the pavilion at hours convenient to conversations you did not wish others to overhear. And I believe that on this last morning, after Monsieur Roger left his uncle alive and angry among the orchids, you went to him yourself, through the rose garden door, meaning to ask him, or perhaps to demand of him, at last, what he had refused you for so long. The room had gone entirely silent. Even Beatrice's pale eyes had softened, very slightly, into something like pity. "He is my father." Ellen's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, and yet in the stillness of that drawing-room it carried to every corner. "I have known it 3 years. My mother told me before she died. A foolish, brief thing, decades ago, before he married Mrs. Wrenfield, and he never knew there had been a child of it, or if he knew, he never once acknowledged it. I took the position here to be near him. I told myself I only wanted to know him, but I watched him give and give, to Roger, to Alistair, to every orchid that caught his fancy, and I had nothing, M. Poirot, nothing at all, not even my own name in his mouth. I asked him that morning, only asked. I told him I did not want his money, only to be known as his daughter before I died the way my mother died, unacknowledged, unclaimed. And he told me?" Her voice cracked entirely now, the handkerchief crushed in her fist. "He told me it would break his wife's heart, and he could not do that to Constance, not even for me, and he turned back to his flowers exactly as he had turned from Roger not 20 minutes before, and I could not bear to be turned from again." She did not finish. She did not need to. Constance Wrenfield had risen from her chair, one hand pressed to her mouth, but it was not, Poirot noted with some quiet surprise, an expression of hatred that had settled upon her grieving face. It was something closer to a terrible, exhausted grief for a stranger she had never known existed, and might, in some other lifetime, have come to love. The Somerset police arrived within the hour, summoned quietly by Dr. Finch, while Poirot sat with Ellen Marsh in the small morning room, saying very little, for there was, he had found over many years, very little that needed saying to a person in that particular kind of ruin. He left Ashcombe Hall 2 days later, on a morning bright enough that the Pavilion, glimpsed once more from the departing car, caught the sun in the same soft, shifting sheets of light it had shown him on his first arrival, as beautiful and as deceptive as it had ever been. "A strange case, this one, George," he remarked to his manservant, some hours later, as the train carried him back toward London. "A room that hid nothing, and a truth that was hidden in it all the same. I confess, I was slow to see it, slower than I would care to admit to any but you. I looked so long for what was concealed behind locked doors that I very nearly forgot to ask what might be concealed within a single, ordinary heart, in plain view of everyone, and seen by no one at all." George, who had learned long ago that his employer's philosophical observations required only the smallest of encouragements, poured the coffee and said nothing, which Poirot had also learned over many years to recognize as George's own particular and entirely sufficient form of understanding. Outside the window, the Somerset countryside gave way slowly to the softer, greyer light of the approaching city, and Hercule Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, thinking not of glass, nor of locks, nor of keys, but of a young woman's small, narrow footprint pressed into ordinary soil, the one true thing, in a room built entirely of light, that light itself had very nearly failed to show him.